What's the difference between a police request and a police command?
A police request invites you to cooperate with something the police officer wants you to do for your own reasons. So, for example, an officer says, "May I look in the trunk of your car?" And you open your trunk because you believe he has good reason to do what he's doing, and you can reassure him that you are not engaged in criminal activity by opening your trunk. So a request gives you a choice. You can decide to cooperate or not to cooperate for your own reasons based on the kind of request he asks. If he said, "Jump up and down and pat your head, I'd really like you to do that," you might say, "Nah, I'm actually really busy. I'm going on my way." But if he says, "I'm looking for a missing person, do you mind if I look in your backyard?" you might say, "Feel free, go ahead." Okay? Either way, you decide based on the content of the question and your desire to cooperate with the government what you're going to do. A command is different. When an officer issues a command, he does two things. He tells you what he wants from you, and implicitly or explicitly, he invokes his authority as a reason for you to comply. So an officer won't always invoke his authority if he's facing you. If you see an officer and he's in uniform and he tells you stop, you will stop. But if you're turned around, he'll shout, "Stop, police." Why? Because he is telling you stop, not because I'm somebody who would really like you to stop moving, but stop because I am invoking the state authority and you have an obligation to comply with that authority. And so independent of the content of the command, he is telling you his state authority gives you a reason to comply with what he's requesting. That's a command.
But you do not have to comply with a police request. I guess my follow-up question is, do we see commands that are phrased as requests and requests that are phrased as commands?
Yes, all the time. So when an officer pulls you over, he issues the first command he issues is the lights and sirens. That's a silent command to pull over. You know that when an officer issues those lights and sirens, that creates your obligation. Up to then, you are free to drive along the road. Once those lights and sirens go on, you are required to pull over under the law. So you follow that command, and then an officer walks up to your car and says, "May I have your license and registration?" May I have your license and registration? Officers will sometimes phrase it as a command, which it is. But even if he phrases it as a polite request, "May I please have your license and registration?" you know that that is actually a command. You have no free choice about whether you give him your license and registration. And if you refuse to do so, you could face legal consequences. That's a command issued as a request, and officers do it pretty often. They're often encouraged to do it. They're told to be polite. They're told to be not intrusive and not coercive. And so they think they're doing the right thing when they phrase commands politely. But that can actually create ambiguity. Sometimes it's really obvious, "License and registration, please," but sometimes it is not. And the politeness is a problem in those situations. So that's a command that's issued as a request. Then we have lots of requests that are issued as at least ambiguous commands. So an illegal command would be open the trunk of your car when the officer has no reason, no probable cause to search the trunk of your car. But an officer might ask you, "Can you pop the trunk, please?" Is that a request with that you are free to comply with, or a command?
Ooh, yeah, that's a tricky one.
You don't really know. And we could say that's a command in the form of a request that then later is going to be argued to be a request that's therefore legal, even though you experienced it in the moment as a command. And that creates this gray zone, which I think it causes a lot of our sense of alienation in encounters with police.
How about feedback? Is it always fine to say, "Officer, is that a request or a command?"
Yeah, it depends what you mean by "is it always fine." you are always permitted to ask to clarify whether something is a request or a command. And it's often a good thing to do because sometimes an officer himself will not have decided whether his statement was a request or a command. And by asking that question, you can actually force the issue. Either it is or it isn't a command. And if he says it's a request, now you have the choice. If he says it is a command, now you don't. I think that can be helpful. The problem is that we really should be training officers not to perceive that question as confrontational. And in fact, sometimes there are a few courts that have actually officers who have argued that somebody was behaving suspiciously because they asked that question.
Wow.
Because they asked for clarification, what they were doing was obviously suspicious. And courts have allowed that to be used as part of the suspicion that justified the command that you were trying to clarify. That's not okay.
That surprises me that a court would find any sympathy for an argument against a question about legal rights.
Several state courts have permitted that question to be treated as part of the suspiciousness of the person's behavior, when what we really should be treating that as a way to clarify an individual's legal relationship with the law. So if you think that police officers are making law effectively when they give you a command, we should be really interested in the circumstances in which law gets made. And it's not like other law. So when a court issues an order, you can appeal that order before it's enforced. You often have time to decide what to do. You can hire a lawyer who can go into court and argue on your behalf. When an officer issues a command, the officer both issues the command and often enforces it in real time. You have no time to decide and no way to appeal or get that revised or get it reviewed. And so I think we have to be really cautious about how these commands get governed on the front end because we have so little opportunity in the moment.
And as you mentioned, Professor, you're being analyzed in the entire time. Even thinking too hard about whether or not you want to comply with a command could be used against you.
Yeah, and I don't want to attribute bad intent. A lot of the ambiguities here come from the fact that officers really often face uncertainty about whether they face a threat. They face uncertainty in their interactions with people. They don't know if you're armed. They don't know if you're drunk. They don't know if you're angry. They don't know if you plan to comply with the law or not. And they often don't know the scope of their own authority to control the situation and yet feel fearful about not controlling the situation. And so I think sometimes giving legal clarity helps officers too when they're trying to do the right thing. I think right now we're not training officers properly with respect to commands.